Hey, I don't know if you can see me very well. It doesn't really matter. I don't look like much anyway these days. I barely look at myself in the mirror, to be honest. You don't really have to look at my videos anyway. You can just listen to what I'm saying. Because there's not much happening visually. It's mostly what I talk about. I just finished watching the latest video by Radish Raven on YouTube, and it hit home because she was talking about France, growing up in France as an undiagnosed autistic person, which is also my experience. And she also left France when she was 18 to go to Sweden, and I left France when I was 20 to go to the UK, and we kind of had the same reasons why we left. We both didn't know we were autistic when we left, but we both left because we knew we wanted something better. We wanted more acceptance and tolerance and a more modern society system, if you will. And we both went to school in other countries. She went to medical school in Sweden. I went to university in the UK. I finished my bachelor's degree and then did my master's degree. Actually, 1.5 master's degrees in England, in London more specifically. And and I just really related to a lot of the things she said in her video. It made me think about a lot of stuff, and so I thought, why not just make a quick video? I have developed actually a lot of trauma from living in France for 20 years. I returned to France about, how long has it been now? Close to 3 months ago. It wasn't a choice for me. It was more of a lesser evil type situation. My partner was tired of the English climate and wanted a warmer climate, and we didn't really know where else to go, and France was right next to England, and it was something we already knew. We already knew the culture, we already knew the language, because my partner's first language is also French. So it seemed like the most obvious option. Also, our landlady was threatening to sell the house. Like, we didn't really have a choice, we had to leave. And being in autistic burnout, I didn't have the strength to face going to a new country, a new culture I didn't know. But I knew coming back that this was gonna be a temporary thing. Like, I know I don't want to stay here indefinitely because I have a lot of trauma from living in France for so long. I just had to close the bedroom door because my partner's on the phone in the next room, and I could hear him talking at the same time, but I couldn't focus on what I was saying. Anyways, so yeah, I have a lot of trauma from just living in France for 20 years, undiagnosed. I also have a lot of trauma from my family, but that's a different type of trauma. A lot of that trauma was triggered again when I came back. I just know that I don't feel at home here. I never felt at home in France. I never felt like I belonged here. Whenever I would come back to France, when I lived in England and I would come back to France for whatever reason, usually to visit family members, or I had that icky feeling, and then whenever I would fly back to England, I would feel like a sense of relief, like, I'm home again, which is really odd because, well, I was gonna say I don't have a connection to England. I actually do, more than I thought, because I did some DNA tests, and it turns out a lot of my ancestry is Celtic and it comes from the UK, which I had no idea. Probably on my dad's side, because I knew quite a bit about my mom's genetics, because my mom's family is originally from Armenia, hence the bushy hair and my big nose. But I had no idea about my dad's ancestry beyond the fact that he is French, from a French family. Turns out I don't really have French genes, which might explain a lot. But I have mostly like genes from the south of Europe, so that came as a surprise to me because I hate the south. I hate the heat. I hate Mediterranean cultures. I like the food though. The food is good. Greek food, Italian food, delicious. But yeah, and I'll have a lot of Celtic genes and then some West Asian Oriental genes. I always felt like it always felt like coming home whenever I traveled to the UK, and I felt so at peace there. I know it's not a perfect country, it's not a perfect culture. It has its flaws, like every country in the world. I didn't have trauma there like I do in France. So anyways, I had a lot of trauma from growing up in France, feeling rejected by everyone. And it wasn't just my own family, it was like the system. I don't know. I was bullied a lot by my teachers. I was bullied by my peers. A lot of that has to do with being autistic. And there wasn't a lot of awareness around neurodiversity, as Radish Raven explained in her video. Yeah, neurodiversity just wasn't really a thing. I heard people talk about dyslexia. I heard people talk about being hyperactive, which is basically ADHD, which was only boys. And I heard people talk about autism maybe once or twice in my life, just very vague statements that didn't make much sense to me, or like didn't paint a picture really in my head, which means that I, in a way, I didn't have any negative stigma about autism when I first figured out I was autistic, so that was a good thing in a way. But I mostly heard that it was mostly boys, or it was only boys, I don't remember, like just stereotypes, right? But that was it. But looking back, now that I have my diagnosis, I can identify a few people that I knew throughout my school years who now really trigger my autism radar. I'm not in touch with those people anymore. We weren't friends to begin with. Well, one of them was my best friend for over 15 years, and we always connected. It was a really weird relationship. It was both deep in some ways and also very unhealthy in other ways. And I mentioned that in previous videos, but it was kind of an abusive friendship in some ways, and a toxic friendship. And I didn't realize how toxic it was until like last year. And since then, I've distanced myself a lot. The reason why we were so close in the first place, and the reason why she was my best friend for so long, and the reason why she was my only friend for a long time, and I didn't really either connect with anyone else, or if I connected with other people, it didn't last as long, was because a couple of years ago, her therapist told her, which really surprised me, because what, a therapist in France? What? But her therapist was like, have you ever considered you might be autistic? And it was around the time that I first discovered stuff about autism and started to question it for myself. And so we were both kind of questioning it at some point. And then I got my diagnosis in February. She still hasn't been diagnosed. But it would make a lot of sense for her to be autistic. And I believe that's the reason why we were so close for so long. And the other person I've ever been that close to is my partner, and he's also autistic, so it makes sense that the people that were the closest to me in my life are neurodivergent. Her autism, just like mine, I would imagine, wasn't very obvious. Obviously, we both mask, being, women. But the other people I wanted to talk about didn't mask as much, or at least when I look back and I think about what I remember, their autistic traits were obvious. Now, I'm not going to say that these people weren't diagnosed, because I have no idea. They might have been diagnosed. I know that some families get their kids diagnosed really young and then they hide the diagnosis from their kids, which is really damaging, actually. Don't do that. Or the kid is aware, but their families tell them not to tell anyone, or just the kid himself or herself doesn't want to tell anyone because they're ashamed. Whatever. There might be 50 different reasons why they might have been diagnosed and just didn't say it. Or I wasn't aware of it. Maybe the teachers were aware, but we weren't. Like, there could be so many things, right? But there's also the possibility that they weren't diagnosed. Because it's France we're talking about. And there's two examples that come to my mind. There's probably more that I could think of, but one of them was a boy and one of them was a girl. And the first one was was it primary school, secondary school, something like that. He was what you would classify as a nerd. So he didn't really seem to care a lot about his appearance. I remember he had the huge pimples on his face. And it triggered me so much because they were so, I don't know. I know you're not supposed to like do anything to your pimples and stuff, but I can't help it when I've got a big white pimple in the middle of my face. I just, I have no choice but to, get rid of it. But he had the biggest pimples and he didn't care at all. That was the first thing that struck me about him. That in itself isn't an autistic trait, right? But he just didn't seem very socially aware, didn't really have many friends. He would stim a lot. I remember he would be constantly rubbing his hands on his thighs, which I heard Dana Anderson talking about that as a stim. He seemed very stressed and he was constantly rubbing his hands on his thighs. He was very short. So he also stood out on a physical level. He was different physically. He was like abnormally short for his age. Very clever, very good in the realms of scientific subjects, I think, unless I'm confusing him with someone else. And he was just very awkward, and also he probably had dyspraxia or something similar because he could not manage at all in sports. Like, he had no coordination. He could not catch a ball with his hands. He could not throw a ball. Like, he was very awkward in his own body, it seemed. I remember my best friend invited him at home once, and at her home. I wasn't there. She told me afterwards. Afterwards, she was like, he was so weird because my mom asked him if he wanted something to eat for, tea time, which we call goûter in France. And he said he only eats this specific brand of cakes or biscuits or whatever, cookies. And that if we didn't have that specific brand of cookies, he wasn't gonna eat anything. And at the time, it seemed to us as such rude behavior, such bad manners. And now looking back, I'm like, no, he was probably autistic, and that was his rigid thinking, and he didn't understand that was rude. I would bet money on this. But yeah, looking back, I think he was definitely autistic, and yeah, we didn't know about it. Maybe he didn't know about it. And the other example I want to talk about actually hurts me more, like makes me feel bad, because there was a lot of bullying going on that I didn't necessarily notice with this other person I talked about. Or there was probably some bullying going on, but I didn't notice it as much. And this other person I'm going to talk about was in high school. So high school is worse in a lot of ways. And so this person was female. Again, like, she stood out physically as well, which didn't help. She was really, really tall. So the first guy I talked about was really, really short, and she was like abnormally tall. And she had like really broad features. Like, she didn't fit the conventional beauty standards for women. You know what I mean? And that's enough to get bullied in our society to begin with. And the reason why I think she was definitely autistic was, well, first of all, she really struggled to make friends. I think she only had like 1 or 2 friends, and she had such intense special interests, and she would get made fun of for those special interests, and she didn't realize it. It seemed like she had no awareness that she was being bullied. Her special interests, I remember, were, well, the 2 that I knew of were Frozen. So that was around the time Frozen came out. And she was so obsessed with Frozen. She would sing, and the other thing that makes me feel bad is that she was really bad at singing, but she would sing nonetheless, and like everyone was making fun of her and she didn't realize it. She had no idea people were making fun of her. And so she loved Frozen, and then one time we had a talent show type thing at school where I played piano, and it was a disaster. And then she decided to sing some Frozen, and she dressed in a Frozen costume. Now, there's this thing in our society where apparently it's okay to make fun of Disney adults, as they're called. So apparently society is okay with kids being into Disney movies, but as soon as you grow up, it's not okay to be into Disney anymore. And it's generally accepted to make fun of Disney adults. It rubs me the wrong way because it seems like very ableist and just not very nice in general. Ableist because a lot of autistic adults happen to be Disney adults, and so when you're making fun of Disney adults, to me, it's like making fun of autistic people for their special interests. Even though I'm aware there are probably Disney adults who aren't autistic, but you know what I mean. And so she was what you would consider a Disney adult. So she loved Frozen. She would dress up as Frozen, as Elsa from Frozen, and sing songs from the movie. And I don't know if it was a combination of people thought she was ridiculous, or the fact that people were really fed up with Frozen, because that was all we heard all the time on the radio. People were really like, couldn't hear Let It Go without being angry, you know? But like she ended up, this very tall girl was dressed in an Elsa costume, singing Let It Go not very well in the middle of the class, and everyone was making fun of her, and she had no idea, which protected her in some ways, I think, but also alienated her in other ways. And at the time, you know, being high masked, which she didn't seem to be, I was very aware of being different, and which is why I masked, to make sure that I didn't appear different, or at least not in ways that would get me bullied and ostracized, whereas she didn't seem to be aware of her differences and didn't seem to mask as much. And so, in a way, it highlighted a lot of my insecurities, you know? And so I joined into some of the bullying. Like, I didn't insult her or anything like that. I wasn't directly bullying her. Like, whenever we interacted one-on-one, I was very respectful. Like, I treated her like a you know, a human being. But whenever the whole class was laughing, I would join in. And now looking back, I feel really bad. And I've thought about reaching out to her and being like, hey, I got my autism diagnosis. Like, does that resonate with you? I'm sorry for the way people treated you in high school. Like, I've thought about it. I don't know if I'll ever do that, but like, I have some guilt because now I know we were probably more similar than I thought. And the reason why I felt like she looked ridiculous, was because she reminded me of the very reasons why I was ostracized myself, you know, like when I would talk about my special interests to people and they would feel like they would be really annoyed or frustrated at me, like for going on and on about the same thing over and over again, like, or people thinking I was ridiculous because I liked childish things, you know. Those were all things I kept to myself to avoid being made fun of, and she didn't. In a way, she was more authentic than me, and maybe I was jealous of that deep down, that she didn't care about what people thought of her. Her other big special interest was Meryl Streep. She was a big Meryl Streep fan, but when I say big Meryl Streep fan, her Facebook page was nothing but quotes from Meryl Streep, pictures of Meryl Streep. Her dream was to become like her. She wanted to study the theater. She wanted to become like Meryl Streep. Again, just like this other kid, I'm like 90% sure that she was autistic as well. And yeah, I feel bad that I took part in some of the making fun of her. But also I'm aware that it's a societal problem more than a me problem, because I probably never would have made fun of her if there hadn't been the social pressure, peer pressure to conform, you know, which I'm detaching from more and more as time goes by, and like going back to being my authentic self rather than trying to conform to society's expectations. And as I do that, it becomes clear to me that that's what she did. She was unapologetically herself, and people rejected her for that. When you look at it that way, there's no real reason to make fun of her, you know? It was just mean. It was just gratuitous meanness, you know? So those were the two people that I felt like, looking back, were probably autistic, that I grew up with, or that went to school with me, let's say, because I was not friends with them. And looking back, the teachers also bullied her the same way they bullied me. And the teachers also thought she was ridiculous, etc. And so it's a much bigger problem, and it's a societal problem. Things haven't really changed. That was 10 years ago. Things haven't really changed, you know? So anyway, that's kind of my little story about growing up undiagnosed, going to school in France undiagnosed. Now, on a bit of a side note, I mentioned in my last video that my partner was on a trip to Disneyland Paris, a 4-day trip, and so he came back last night. It reminded me of a struggle that I have that I had kind of forgotten about, because like I said, we don't get separated very often. And so I was reminded of it last night, of the struggle that I have when we're reunited. And what I mean by that is, so I struggle when we get separated. I tend to cry a lot. I tend to feel a lot of sadness and worry and anxiety and stuff. And then when we're reunited again, it's very awkward for me. Like, there's also obviously a lot of joy at being reunited and stuff, but there's also a lot of awkwardness. And of course, those were the types of things that I felt very ashamed of before I got diagnosed. I thought, it's not normal for me to experience this. A lot of awkwardness, and also a type of sadness, because when he leaves, I'm sad that he's leaving and that we'll be separated for a few days. But when he comes back, I'm sad that I have to live with someone else again. Does that make sense? Because when I'm on my own, once I get over the initial grief and anxiety of being alone and him being away, which lasts a day or two, then I get in sort of a groove where I actually enjoy myself a lot because I get to be fully in control of my environment and my daily life, and I only have to worry about myself in the sense of like, I don't have to worry about making food for the both of us or accommodating someone else's needs. And it's very it's therapeutic for me to have to worry only about myself, if that makes sense. And also, like, I realized, for example, that during the whole duration of that whole time that he was away, I never wore my sunglasses or my headphones once, and that's because I'm in control of my environment sensory-wise. When he came back last night, like, you know, he'll turn on a bright light and forget to close the door, or he'll be making food downstairs and maybe he'll put on music or a show, or he'll be stimming vocally, you know, as he does, and I'm like instantly overstimulated, you know, and I miss that sort of quiet that I had and that sense of control that I had when I was on my own. And that's the sense of autonomy also, and not being perceived, which you don't get as much when you're living with someone. No matter how much I enjoy living with my partner, and like, I wouldn't have it any other way. I wouldn't want to be single. I wouldn't want to live on my own. When I do find myself on my own, these are things that I enjoy. Being fully in control of my environment, of how I choose to spend my day, not depending on someone, not having to think of someone else's needs, things like that. And so when he comes back, it's always kind of bittersweet because I'm like, oh, I have to transition back. And it's also the struggle with change, you know? I struggle with the change of going from living together to being on my own, and then I get used to that, and then I have to transition back to living together. And every time there's adjustments that need to be made mentally. And so whenever we're reunited, and the longer he's away, the more impactful it is. Whenever we're reunited, it's always kind of bittersweet. And in the past, I didn't understand where those feelings were coming from. And so I would find faults in our relationship where there weren't any, and that would hurt the relationship. Whereas now I know it comes from a need for autonomy and independence that is very common in autism. And now that I can put words on this and identify where it's coming from, it doesn't feel like it's coming from the relationship anymore, and so the relationship doesn't suffer from it as much, if that makes sense. But yeah, those are like, there's a lot of emotions around that, and also that awkwardness I feel when we meet again. I always struggled with that. I don't like it when I'm reunited with someone and when we're separated. Like, I guess those are transitions. They're, you know, moments of change. And also there's a lot of expectations around those moments. And that's something I was able to identify thanks to ChatGPT. Because I was trying to figure out, for example, why I struggle so much with saying hello to people, saying goodbye, saying thank you. All these kind of formal greetings and statements. And I realized while I was chatting with ChatGPT about it, I realized those are like social expectations that don't necessarily align with my own way of functioning, my own way of communicating as an autistic person. And so it triggers my PDA in a sense. And I think that's what I felt, like that deep discomfort I felt every time I had to greet someone, to the point of avoiding it whenever I could. I would avoid, whenever I would see my parents, I would avoid saying goodnight in the evening. I would go to bed before everyone else, or when they weren't looking, so that I didn't have to say goodnight, because it felt like almost physically painful to say goodnight to people. And it's not just my parents. Same thing happens with my in-laws, for example. It's like, and it sounds ridiculous because people like neurotypical people wouldn't understand. They'd be like, what's wrong? Like, what's so difficult about saying hi and thank you? Like, it's such a small word. And I agree, which is why I didn't understand for the longest time why they caused so much discomfort. And now I think it has to do with PDA. It has to do with the fact that there's like an expectation, there's some type of social pressure to say these things at a certain time in a certain way, and my persistent drive for autonomy or pathological demand avoidance kicks in, where I'm like, I get, it's almost a sense of panic, you know, like I don't want to do this because I have to, you know? Yeah, and the same, so every time when I'm not with the person, it's fine. When I'm with the person, it's fine. When we have to meet initially and greet each other, and when we have to leave, it's difficult. And even with my own partner, who is the person I'm the most comfortable with on the whole planet, even with him, it's uncomfortable. And it has nothing to do with the person. It's the expectation around that moment, you know? When you meet someone, there's that moment when you're walking towards them, they're walking towards you. First of all, I'm like, I don't know where to look, because it's awkward staring at that person the whole way. So I'm like looking at the floor, but then I'm like, they'll think that I'm not excited to see them. So there's all that, like, what do I do with my body? And then there's an expectation of certain facial expressions that you're supposed to make, you know, to show that you're happy to see the person. There's just so much pressure to perform in a certain way. This specific social ritual, and then specific things you have to say. It's not that I don't know what to say. It's that because I have to say these things, it triggers my PDA, and I'm like, nope. And I still say those things, but it's almost like I have to tear the words out of my mouth, and it's physically painful. And it's to such an extent that a lot of the time people can't hear me, and I have to repeat myself. I'll say hello, and because it's so difficult for me, I don't say it loud enough, apparently, and people don't hear it, and so then they think, and so it often results in people thinking I'm rude, or I'm not happy to see them, or whatever. Being misunderstood, common thing in autism. And so for the longest time, people would think that I was rude, that I didn't like them because I would avoid saying goodnight, or things like that. And when I meet my partner, even though I love him to death, there's always that awkwardness that stems from, like, I'm expected to perform in a certain way, and I don't like it. Like, I don't feel autonomous. I don't feel free to do this in my own way. And so I don't know, it feels very uncomfortable. And so it's always kind of awkward. And like last night, he came home and I was upstairs, and so I said hi to him from a distance, and then he climbed up the stairs, and I was like, I didn't know where to look, and I was so awkward, and he saw it, and he was like, oh, you're so awkward and stuff. And for the first time I was able to, because it was the first time we were separated since I got my diagnosis, for the first time I was able to put words on it and be like, yeah, it's just my autistic awkwardness, like, yeah, I feel so uncomfortable. It's all these ritualized social interactions I struggle with. And they make me feel, there are some of the things that make me feel the most weird and out of place and different, because they seem so easy for everyone else, No one else seems to have an issue with those kinds of greetings or rituals, And if you bring it up to the wrong person, it might sound like you're just rude or disrespectful, because a neurotypical might hear that and be like, so you're saying you can't be bothered to say hello or thank you or goodbye? Like, you're the rudest person I've ever met. Because they wouldn't understand, Because to them, it's a no-brainer. They literally don't have to think about it. Whereas I do. It's very much a conscious effort. Anyways, and I got my new laptop, which is great because I'll be able to edit my videos more easily. And I'll be able to edit them from my bed while I'm still recovering from burnout. But that also comes with a lot of change, and I expected it because I know that those types of changes, when I change to a new electronic device, for example, it's a big change, and those tend to be very stressful moments for me. And again, I feel like there's this social expectation to be super happy about getting a new laptop, and if you're not, then you seem ungrateful. It's hard because of course I'm happy to have a new laptop. Are you kidding me? Like, the old one was 8 years old, barely functioning anymore. Obviously, I'm very happy, I'm over the moon. But for a few days, even like when I got my first Mac and I first transitioned between Windows and Mac, it took me literal weeks, if not months, to get used to it. I was really uncomfortable for a really long time because it was all so new to me and I struggled with the change, you know? And even though this time around I'm transitioning from a MacBook Pro to a MacBook Air, so it's a less, the change, the differences aren't so, there aren't so many differences between the two. It's still a big change for me. And whatever, you know, change, autism, they don't go well together. So I struggle and it brings a lot of stress. And I've had meltdowns in the past over changing electronic devices, or just not even changing the device itself. Sometimes my partner will do, because my partner works in IT, like he's a software developer, software engineer. So he knows about all that stuff, and he'll do like something on my laptop or on my phone, and I will freak out because I don't have control, because I'm scared, I have anxiety, or I struggle with the change, or like whatever. I have had meltdowns in the past over things like that. Of course, people don't get that. They don't understand. I got my new laptop, and I sent a picture to my in-laws, and they were like, so are you happy? And I was like, yeah, of course, but you know, it's a big change for me, and you know, it will take a few days, blah blah. And they were like, thankfully you have like a good teammate, meaning my partner works in, you know, software engineering, so he can figure it out. And I was like, it's not so much the technical aspects, it's just the fact that it's a big change, and you know, as an autistic person, I struggle with that kind of stuff. But I can tell that people don't really get it, because to them it's like why would you experience anything other than joy at having a new laptop? Like, they can't register it, they can't process it, and it always comes across as you being rude or ungrateful somehow. So yeah, I wanted to throw that in there. I felt very overwhelmed earlier today. And it's the same thing when people like buy me gifts or whatever, like a Christmas, birthday, or whatever. It's overwhelming. There's lots of things, lots of new things to look at, and it's like almost just like too much information for my brain. And so I will get overwhelmed. And again, people will interpret that as me being ungrateful, like, you're not happy with your gifts. I'm like, I am. I just need time to process it. And then there's a lot of expectation around, like, you have to show that you're grateful, and you have to do certain facial expressions, and you have to say to people how grateful you are and thank them, and you have to open your gifts in front of people, and you feel incredibly perceived, and everyone's looking at you, and it's super uncomfortable. Like, there's a whole thing around it. And then, you know, there are just so many expectations, social expectations around receiving gifts. And like, if you don't fit these in some way, or just because you're slightly overwhelmed, like suddenly, like, people are like, there's something off with you, you know, like, so much pressure. And again, it has nothing to do with the gift itself or me not being happy. Like, it could be the best thing in the world. Even more so, I would say, if it's the best thing in the world for me, because I'll get such strong positive emotions surrounding that gift that I can get overwhelmed from that. Like, too much of any emotion is hard to process, you know? I guess what I'm saying is, I'm just highlighting all the ways in which we tend to get misunderstood as autistic people in this society and in life, in relationships. And it's all these little things that add up and make us anxious when we have interactions with people, social situations. It's all those little things. I was pretty overwhelmed earlier today. narrowly escaped a meltdown of some sort. I just felt very overwhelmed, and then I managed to regulate by thinking of something else, like watching a movie or whatever. And I was able to regulate again. But like, yeah, I got really overwhelmed at one point because it's just so much new stuff to process and get used to. And like, on top of having a new laptop, my partner was like, let's use this new browser. And I was like, you want me to have a new device plus a new browser on the same day? Like, this is a lot. For most people, these things are fine. They don't even have to think about them, but for autistic people, it can be a lot. And even within the autistic community, it's different from person to person. Some autistic people don't struggle, like my partner doesn't struggle with that kind of stuff, for example. Human beings are complex, regardless of their neurotype. I'll end this video on that note. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!